My name is Keith Robert Gordon, broker for All True Realty, and I've talked to a lot of realtors over the differences between the as-is contract, the FARBAR as-is versus the regular FARBAR contract. We also call it the repair limit contract. And I heard a funny thing the other day from a realtor friend that said that she likes the regular contract, not the as-is, because it keeps buyers in the deal as the market's falling from just jumping out of a deal. Because the regular contract, you can keep the buyer in the deal up to the repair limits. By default, they're 1.5% for three categories for a total of 4.5%. So for a buyer, sometimes it's very difficult to escape the regular non-as-is contract. Now we're talking about the difference between the FARBAR as-is and the FARBAR regular contract. For me, I don't like the regular contract. And the reason why I don't like the FARBAR regular is this. I don't like lawsuits. I've never been involved in a real estate lawsuit. And the reason why is because I'm very smart about dealing with contracts. I don't like when a contract presents a lot of options for buyers and sellers to think about alternatives other than sticking between the four corners of the contract. The four corners means right here, this is the envelope of the contract, here are the terms, read it and stick with it. If you read the four corners of the regular repair limit contract, it might take you a week to get through it. So the repair limit section of a regular contract says that as long as the repairs on the home are less than a certain amount or a certain percentage, let's say the default's 1.5% or you set it at $5,000, whatever. But when they do the inspection report, and that report says that the repairs are $2,000 or $3,000, they're under, let's say, the stated $5,000 repair limit, you cannot escape that contract as a buyer. Therefore, your escrow is non-refundable. How are you going to get it back? Because all the seller has to do to perform under the four corners of the contract would be for them to do what the buyer's inspector says is wrong with the property. And if the buyer changes their mind, they can't change their mind because of the inspection report because they've got you. You're under the repair limit. That is what's wrong with the FARBAR contract with regard to buyers and their escrow. It puts you in an untenable situation. Now we're talking about the escrow. So when a buyer in a regular FARBAR contract puts in escrow, the question is, how do I get it back? Well, one way is you can close the deal, right? And you use the escrow as a credit towards your closing. But what if you want to cancel the deal? Well, you can't cancel a deal with a regular contract as a buyer as long as the repairs stated in the inspection report are less than the stated repair limits in the repair limit section. The repair limits could be, as I said before, 1.5% of the contract amount. Maybe it's $5,000. Maybe it's $1,000. But you cannot escape the deal as long as the inspection report says there's only this much wrong with the home and that amount is less than the repair limits. That is crazy for a buyer. Why do they do it? So we're talking the differences between the FARBAR regular contract and the FARBAR as-is contract. And we're talking about the buyer being able to escape a contract if they wish. Now, the premise that I have in my head is this, that if you're a buyer, there are situations where you'd want to get out of a contract. It's not a question that you didn't love the home to begin with. You did. But there's something in the inspection report. There's something that just happened in your life. It doesn't really matter. But there are times when a buyer says, you know what, I don't want to buy that home. I don't care what the seller does to fix what's wrong with it. I just want out. More on that in a second. So we're talking about the difference between the FARBAR regular and the FARBAR as-is real estate contract in the state of Florida in particular, because that's where I am, and that's what we're talking about. And there's a clause in the regular FARBAR contract, not the as-is, in the regular contract, that says the buyer really cannot escape the contract under any conditions if the seller will just repair what's wrong with the home. So as I said before in the prior videos, that if the repair limits are set at $5,000 in the repair limit section of the regular contract, which means that the seller has agreed in advance to fix anything that's wrong with the house that meets certain conditions for $5,000. But it also says this. It says on line number 313 of page 6 of 14 of the regular FARBAR contract that if the repairs exceed the general repair limit, then within 5 days after the party's receipt of the last estimate, seller may elect to pay the excess by delivering written notice to a buyer. So in other words, repair limits are $5,000, the repairs are $6,000 or $8,000 or $10,000. The seller has complete control. They can just notify you within 5 days of you notifying them of what you want by saying, you know, I see the repair limits we agreed to before are $5,000. I'll go ahead and fix it for $7,000. And guess what, buyer? You cannot get out of that contract. That's the reason I favor the as-is contract as opposed to the regular contract. It allows more flexibility for the buyer to change their mind and still get their escrow back during the inspection period. So my warning to buyers, before you sign a FARBAR regular contract, realize what the repair limits are all about. And realize that if you put in escrow amount of $5,000, you might not ever get that $5,000 back. If you put in $10,000, that's even more of a problem. But if you put in $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000, I think you'd be rather upset if you finally realized once you didn't want the house for whatever reason, your dog didn't like the dog house, you didn't like the paint color, you cannot escape that regular contract as long as the repairs stated in the inspection report are less than the repair limits stated in the contract. Careful as you go, buyers. So we're talking about the differences between the FARBAR regular and the FARBAR as is. The biggest problem I have is that if a seller is going to try to keep a buyer in a deal, because let's say the roof is dead, it's over 15 years old, let's say it's 25 years old, the regular contract says that curling shingles, fiberglass shingles that are curled, cement roof tiles that are cracked, as long as that roof isn't leaking, that's a fine roof and there's nothing we need to do about it. Well, from a buyer's perspective, that is a heck no. If a buyer's got a dead roof, they want some concessions. But a seller can keep a buyer in a deal even with a dead roof. As a listing agent, I wouldn't even want to use that, but a lot of listing agents would want that to keep the buyer in. I wouldn't. I don't do real estate that way. Certainly from a buyer's perspective, it would be a no. From a seller's perspective, it could be a maybe. More on that in a second. So we're talking about the difference between the FARBAR as is and the FARBAR regular contract. From a seller's perspective, the FARBAR regular contract is likely better because read the fine print. Buyer cannot escape that contract within the repair limits without a huge fight. So if I'm representing a buyer, which I seldom do, I usually represent sellers, I would never put my buyer in a situation where they would be forced to close a transaction. Now we're talking about the difference between the FARBAR regular contract and the as-is FARBAR contract. Now, there is a difference between performance as well. In the regular contract, the seller can pursue the buyer in equity to close the transaction. Now, I just had one of my dear friends purchase a property. He's a lawyer, pretty smart. And I didn't represent him in this buy. It was a private deal, but I saw that he crossed out pursue an equity because he doesn't want to be sued to close a transaction should he not want to. But the language states that seller can actually pursue an equity against the buyer to close the transaction. That would be a no for me. All right, we're talking about the regular FARBAR contract versus the as-is FARBAR contract. We're talking about performance. Both contracts state that if the seller doesn't sell the property and agree to close, right, the buyer can pursue the seller with specific performance. That's true in both contracts. Now we're talking about the difference between the FARBAR as-is contract and the FARBAR regular contract. And I favor, of course, the as-is contract, not the regular. But I want to show you what the repair limits look like. So this is the repair limit section of the FARBAR regular. You see that 1.5% times 3 categories? The 3 categories are termites, general repair, and open permits. As a seller, you wouldn't necessarily want to agree to all that because it's a lot of money. You can't really negotiate too well when it says right here that you're allocating 4.5% of the sales price to remediate any problems that might come into an inspection report. That's not negotiating. What that is keeping both the buyer and the seller in the transaction and not allowing them to escape. That's why some realtors like it, and that's why I don't like it. If a buyer wants out, Get them out of the deal. I never want to force a buyer to close a transaction. So we're talking about the as-is FARBAR contract versus the regular FARBAR contract or the repair limit contract. Now I want to show you my markups on this page. I'm on page number 6 of 14. This is the 1021 version of the regular contract or the repair limit contract. And take a look at my markups. Look at the yellow. Now why is that significant? Well, all right, so this is kind of crazy. Here's how it works. Buyer inspects the property. They pay $500 for inspection report. Give it to the seller. They got repair limits to say, you got to fix these things if what's wrong with the house in this report is lower than the repair limit. And then the seller goes, I don't agree with you. I'm going to get my own report. So they buy a report for $500. They give it to the buyer. The buyer says, well, you know what? I don't agree with that report. So you know what they do then? They get a third report. Talk about that next. All right, we're talking about the difference between the FARBAR and the regular contract. And we just said that if the buyer gets an inspection report and the seller doesn't like it, the seller gets one. If the buyer doesn't like it, they share the cost of a third report. And then the third inspection report that they share, as I said, the cost of, that report is how you buy the home. Whatever's in that report, both the buyer and the seller have got to agree. And if they don't agree, you know what they do then? They sue each other. That's crazy. That's not real estate. That's a bunch of contract language that's this long. If come, maybe we do this, this, and this. How about just use an as-is FARBAR contract so everybody can just escape the deal? And the things that need to be negotiated, we negotiate them. That's what we do. We're negotiators. We're realtors. The most bizarre part about the regular FARBAR contract is this language. This is like so funny. All right, we're talking about things that are called cosmetic items. Ready? These are cosmetic. They don't matter to a buyer. Cracked roof tiles, curling or worn shingles, or limited roof life. That means a dead roof, older than 15 years old. It says, shall not be considered defects that seller must repair or replace, so long as there is no evidence of actual leaks or structural damage. Oh, well, good luck with that with a buyer. If you represented a buyer and they had to close a transaction with a dead roof because the buyer's agent didn't know what they were doing, or maybe they did, they were trying to hold their buyer in a deal, but whatever the reason is, it is not practical for the buyer and it's not good juju. Don't do it. Thank you.